Okay, thanks very much. You're going to dip the lights a bit. Now, first of all, can everyone hear me? Is the mics all working fine? That's good. Okay, well, thanks for coming out this evening to listen to this talk on masons, miners and scissors, all kinds of bees that can be found in meadows around Devon and elsewhere in the country. As Donna said, the talk will last about 50 minutes. I'll give you a brief introduction to myself, introduce you to the world of bees, and then I'll look at some of the bees that occur in this country, talk about their habits, some of their parasites, and also how you can manage land for them, so how you can encourage bees. So I've been interested in natural history ever since I was 3 years old. So I've studied natural history all my life, and I'm very passionate about getting out in the field and studying all sorts of things. So this is a few of the different things I get out and watch: adders and long-tailed tits and frogs and giant tuna and all sorts of things like that. So I'm out every day looking for things, and I'm lucky enough to make this my work as well. So I work as call myself a consultant entomologist or wildlife consultant. I live in Buckfordsley, just on the southern edge of the moor. Originally I grew up on Hayling Island in Hampshire, but then I came down to the West Country in the late 1980s to Falmouth Art College, where I studied graphic design, and then I ended up working for Dartmoor National Park Authority as a graphic designer for several years before going freelance. So I live with my wife Joyce, who's here today. She retired from teaching about a year ago now. We have two sons, Barnaby sitting down. He's a hurdy-gurdy maker and computer programmer, and he lives in Vienna. And Oscar is a outdoor instructor, and he works at Skern Lodge at Appledore in North Devon. I've always liked to explore the natural world through observation, so primarily through drawing and painting in the field. When I'm out, I just use a bare minimum kit, a few tubes of watercolour and pencils and my paints, and take them out and draw things in the field. So I'm out as much as I can be. This was on Monday. I went down to St Ives. I was drawing some Arctic skuas which were flying by on the coast that day. That was good. And I've since been out watching tuna and ivy bees today out on the coast, and I'll talk about ivy bees a bit later on. So this is my sketching kit. So I take my pots of water and sat out on the windy cliff and paint in the fields. I don't actually paint when I'm at home. And I use these illustrations in a variety of ways. I've published several books over the years on the wildlife of Dartmoor, mini beasts and rockpool life. And I also write and illustrate a section in the Dartmoor magazine. And the latest one's all about fungi, if you're interested in those. And as well as that, I make my field paintings into cards. So Joyce has got, if you're interested in having a look at the cards, so go and see Joyce during the break or at the end of the talks. When I'm taking photographs, I use three cameras, two bridge cameras, a Sony RX10 Mark IV on the left there, which I use a lot for slow motion. I use a Canon SX70 bridge camera with a little fluffy top on, that's to stop the wind noise, and a little Olympus Tough camera, which is really good for slow motion and for close-up things as well. I've done a lot of work for television over the years, and I did quite a bit of work for Wild Isles, which was on a year or so ago now. I did some work on the mating slugs on Dartmoor, if you watched and enjoyed that bit, and the ash black slug, the largest slug in the world, and also bees, the broomstick bee they called it, which nests in snail shells. And another film I worked on, which hasn't actually been aired on terrestrial television in this country, called My Garden of 1,000 Bees, which is a fabulous film made by Martin Dawn in Bristol, and hopefully it will be shown eventually, but it's a magical film all about the bees in his garden, and it won some of the very, very top awards that any wildlife films can win, so it's well worth seeing if you get a chance. On to the bees then. I mean, when people think of bees, it's often I'm out in the field, people asking me what I'm doing. I'm looking at bees. They think, are you a beekeeper then? I'll say, well, not really. I study wild bees. So to most people, bees are honeybees and maybe a bumblebee, but they're just part of the bee, the populations of bees and species that we find in this country. So there's about between 270 and about 280 different types of bee, one honeybee, about 25 odd bumblebees, and the rest are solitary bees. which are quite unobtrusive, and they're, you know, in a way quite little known really, because they're not easy to see unless you know how to look for them often. Bees and wasps and ants are all in the same group, so they're the Culeate Hymenoptera, they're called. They have stings, well the females do anyway, so they're all quite closely related. So all females have stings. They can't all sting you, but no male bee or wasp or even a hornet like this has got a sting. So if you know it's a male, you can pick it up. I did check many times before I did it the first time, but male hornets are actually quite easy to identify once you know, but I would advise you to check. Bees have evolved from wasps, so originally it was about 120 million years ago that bees evolved, so they've been around on the planet a long time, and they evolved from hunting wasps, a bit like this one, which is the video playing now. Yeah, this is a little sand wasp, which is down in Cornwall, and this is a solitary wasp. The female hunts for caterpillars. She digs a burrow in the ground and then amazingly managed to carry this huge caterpillar back to her nest. So this is a provision for her young, so she'll bury it in there and then she'll lay an egg on it, and her larva will eat the paralysed caterpillar alive. So really bees are a sort of vegan versions of these creatures. They've evolved from these, and they really evolved as flowers evolved about 120 million years ago. And that's the caterpillar I dug out, and you can see, this is the pointer there, there's the egg of the wasp. Where is it? Somewhere on the side, just there. So that's the egg of the wasp, and then the larva will consume the entire caterpillar. And some of these solitary wasps, as well as being hunters, they're also really good at building things. So you can see how some of these social bees, you know, the honeybees and bumblebees and hornets, which build these amazing nest structures, they all sort of evolved from creatures like this, the Heath potter wasp, which builds little mud pots. This is on Bovey Heath. Here we go. So the females of these are solitary, and they collect little balls of mud, about 25 balls of mud, and they collect some water, make a little ball of mud, and then make a ring pot, make this beautiful construction. And then once it's completed, the female will lay an egg inside, and then she'll collect about up to 38 little caterpillars and put them inside as food for her larva. And she'll make about 20 odd of those pots in her lifetime. And there's one bringing in a pug moth caterpillar. They're actually quite tiny, these pots. They're about the size of a big pea, and they always look much bigger in photographs than they do actually when you see them. So, as I said, there's about 16,000 species of bee in the world, so they're a very successful group. The largest is this giant leafcutter bee, which lives out in Southeast Asia, in Borneo or somewhere like that. And it's a monster thing, and it burrows into termite mounds, I think. The smallest one is a tiny little 2 millimetre long bee. So there's a huge variation in size within the family. They've been quite well studied in Devon over the years. We've had a few eminent entomologists who particularly study bees, William Alfred Leach, Bignell, Perkins, and another Perkins, son of the original one. So we know a lot about the historic state of bees in the county. And also Malcolm Spooner, who died in the late 1980s. He did a lot of work on the distribution of bees on Dartmoor and elsewhere in Devon. At that time, and when I started, about sort of 15 years ago, getting interested in bees, there wasn't much, it was quite hard to identify them. But since then, there's been a few publications which have made identification a lot easier than it was when I started. And these are Stephen Falk's book and George Else and Mike Edwards' books on the bees of the British Isles. And as well as these books, there's excellent websites. There's the Bee Wars website, the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Scheme website, which has got information on all of those Culeate Hymenoptera, so all the bees, wasps and ants. There's detailed information on there. And Stephen Falk's got an amazing website. If you search for Stephen Falk Flicker Bees, you'll find it. and his website's fantastic. He's got photographs of all the British bees, and it's updated with any new ones that appear as well. So they're not, once you get into them, they're not, some of them are quite easy to identify and some of them are quite difficult. This is quite a common one in the spring, an orange-tailed mining bee. It's a fairly common spring flying species. And when they're fresh like this, the females are very easy to identify. They have a rusty red thorax and a little rusty red tip to the abdomen. But they're mining bees and they mine underground. So this is a few weeks later, they start losing their hairs, and then towards after a couple of months of burrowing underground, it's only because I know what it is that otherwise I would struggle to identify it if you didn't know that by looking at a few features on it what it was. It looks just like a sort of denuded bee, sort of fat bee. Bumblebees, they may look sort of easy to identify, but actually they're quite tricky at times. There's quite amongst the bumblebees, there's a number of species which look very similar. They're easiest to identify in the spring when the queens are out. There's a few common species which you can identify then, but later in the year it can be a bit more tricky. This one, if you see, has got some mites on it, and these aren't, they're not harming the bee, they're actually phoretic mites, so they're hitchhikers. They're actually mites which live in bumblebee nests, and the only way to get to the new nest the following year is to jump onto the young queen bees, and then they hibernate on the young queen bees, and then when they start a nest in the spring, then they can hop off and live in the nest, breed there over the summer, and then when the new queens from that generation come out, then the mites hop only onto the queens, and then they'll get to a new nest next year. This is one of our smallest bees. So we have as well, we haven't got a 2 millimetre long bee, but we've got a number of bees which are tiny. This one's about 5 or 6 millimetres long. We've got a Lasioglossum furrow bee. It's called Minutissimum. It's a good name for it. And another little one which is a little scissor bee, and this one loves bellflowers. And it's quite a very hard bee to see because it's so tiny. You see it just here, and it's only a few millimetres long. But if you plant nettle-leaf bellflowers and other bellflowers in your garden, you may well have this thing around. It will suddenly appear from nowhere, but you have to look closely for it. Now, and I planted some in our garden because we have a small garden in Buckfordsley, and this was it when we first acquired the house in about 25 years ago now. And there weren't many bee species, or probably none living in the garden. But since then we've transformed the garden into a sort of wildlife haven, particularly for bees. Now I've recorded nearly 40 species, including this week a new one, the ivy bee appeared. So that was a new species for the garden this week. So even in a relatively small area, if you put the right plants in there and right nesting habitats as well, as I'll talk about during the talk, you can attract quite a large number of species into a small area. Some bees in Devon have declined quite significantly over the last 100 years or so. This is a great yellow bumblebee, which used to occur in Devon, but now it's disappeared really, and it's from all of England and Wales. And you can, if you want to see it, you have to go right up to the north of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides, or the northwest coast of Ireland. So it's one of these. It's a big bumblebee, and it needs lots of flowers. So this is a site on Belmullet in northwest Ireland, and when you go there, there's absolutely huge swathes of flowers, and you can see why it's disappeared from England and the southern counties, because all those old hay meadows that used to be full of flowers are pretty well all gone, and so this bee just couldn't survive in that landscape. It wasn't adapted. It's quite a big, heavy bee, and it needs to be able to have all that food close to it. And another bee, which we used to have on Dartmoor, the small scabious mining bee, which likes devil's bit scabious, used to be reasonably common on Dartmoor, but I've never seen it, and friends have looked for it, and we can't find it. And it also has a cuckoo bee, which I'll talk about in a minute. So it has a thing called a silver-sided cuckoo bee, and this is the small scabious mining bee. The nearest site where there are any numbers of these now is just in South Wales, just near Newport, actually, on the outskirts of Newport. There's a park, and there's absolutely swathes of devil's bit scabious. So all these fields behind and lots of fields behind were all covered in devil's bit scabious, and there was a really good population of the bee and its cuckoo bee there as well. Haven't all declined, as I'll talk about. This is some new species are appearing as well, maybe through climate change, or they've just been overlooked in the past. This is a red-vented mining bee, which is at the moment only known from one place in Hampshire, and it feeds on willows in the spring, so it probably is more widespread, but so far hasn't been found anywhere else. One of the ways that people attract bees to firstly solitary bees in their gardens, if you have a bee hotel. And I've got one of these nurturing nature bee hotels which you can actually look inside, which really is a brilliant thing to have. Either make one or buy one, because they're really fabulous, because you can actually see the bees in action. And the most common bee which moves in is the red mason bee, and you can actually see the life cycle of them through these, because you can, once the bees are nesting in there, they fly in April and May time. They're quite happy if you just open the side up and have a look. And this is a female, so she's built a little mud partition. She's collected some pollen, and then she's laying an egg on that pollen, and then she'll seal up that cell and leave her larva to develop. So then the larva will feed on the pollen supply and feed up over a week or so, and then it will spin a cocoon, and then it will sit in that cocoon right through the winter as an adult bee, actually. So I clean out my bee hotels and take all the cocoons out over the winter time, keep it clean and free of disease, really. Other bees that do this is a hairy-footed flower bee. So this is one of the earliest flying bees in the spring, and this one will overwinter as an adult bee. And I've got them in some cob bricks, which I'll show you in a minute. And one winter the bricks got wet, and we had some building work done. And some of the bricks, the cob bricks, which the bees were nesting in, broke open. So I brought out all the bees inside. You could see the adult bees were in there, ready to get flying on the first warm days of spring. So they will fly from the end of February time if it's mild, but usually through March, April is their main time to fly. They're lovely little bees, and they're common in many gardens. This is a male with his little yellow face. The female's black, like a little black bumblebee that hovers around, and they really like flowers like lungworts and early flowering grape hyacinths, things like that, which flower early in the year. The male has long, hairy middle legs, and he uses this in the courtship with the female. So the males will fly around. With bees, there's not a lot of courtship. This one has a little bit, but the male will fly around, jump on the female, and then he waves his hairy legs around in a little display. And no one knows quite sure why he does that. But they're entertaining things to watch. This is a little video. This is the male. The males stalk after the female and jump on them, which happens a lot with bees, and I'll show you some more videos later. And there's his hairy leg little dart. He seems to tap the female's antennae. Now, I got the idea for making cob brick bee hotels from this wall in Alphington Church in Exeter. And this is a really old cob wall, south-facing, and it's got hundreds of these bees nesting in there. So it's a really fantastic place. So I got hold of some red clay soil and made some cob. It's not quite as good as the cob that was in that wall, because whoever built that was a genius at building cob. So I have to keep mine dry, because if it gets wet, they will disintegrate. So I keep them in a box with some roofing felt over, and keep them dry there, and they're fine. The bees have moved into our garden, and we've got the hairy-footed flower bee colony in the garden, which is lovely, and also attracted their cuckoo bees. So about a quarter of the bees in this country don't actually make their own nests and collect pollen and nectar themselves. They sneak into other bees' nests and let them do the work. So in the case of the hairy-footed flower bee, there's this mourning bee, and this one comes along. It looks quite mean, and it comes along and sneaks in the nest, and then lays an egg. The females lay an egg in there, and her larva destroys the egg or larva of the host bee, and then eats all its food. Also in this wall, there's these spiders. They're called Segestria florentina. They're green fang wall spiders. And they usually feed on wood lice and things like that, and they hide in holes in walls. But in this particular wall, they can't believe their luck, because in the spring, you get all these big bees, juicy bees turning up, and they get a nasty shock when they're looking for somewhere to roost or nest. It just got away, but then that one unfortunately got caught by the spider. Now, the most bees, when they originally evolved, it's thought that they were associated with particular flowers. So they were, one flower had its own bee, and that still happens with certain bees in this country. And this is a blunt horn bee. It looks like its antenna has been chopped off at the end. So you identify this little family of bees. There's a few species we have, and this one only feeds on sainfoin. And so wild sainfoin is only found on Salisbury Plain. It is grown as a fodder crop, but that type doesn't attract the bee because it doesn't flower at the right time. But if you go onto Salisbury Plain, where you find some sainfoin, this is near Till's Head, you see these beautiful bees in the summer. In late June, early July is the best time. The males and females are often quite different looking as well with some of these species. It does make identification a little bit tricky. And again, the male here, you'll see in a minute, patrols around the flowers looking for females that have just emerged. The females will only mate once, and he patrols around, hovers about a bit like the hairy-footed bee. And then if he sees a female, he'll pounce on her. There he is, he's eyeing her up, and then after mating, the male will fly off, try and find another female, and the female will then dig a burrow in the ground. And in this case, the sort of places that they nest are quite important. They need some sort of well-drained ground, which is fairly easy to burrow in. And in this case, they're along a track. And in the middle of the track, the ground's a bit more raised. There's some little edges in it. It's quite well drained. And all these sainfoin bees are nesting in the middle there and in the edges of the track. So it's bits of bare ground and easily sort of friable soil in sunny spots is often the places that these bees nest. And providing those sort of habitats close to meadows is good for them. So these are typical mining bee burrows. You may, unless you really sit, they're quite shy creatures, and unless you sit quietly, you may not see them because there's lots of things after them, like cuckoo bees and different things like that. So they tend to just shoot into their burrow and then come out again, and they're off. And they're also very busy collecting food for their young. But you may see little mounds like this on your lawn appear, and these will be mining bees of various species. There's probably about 70 or 80 species of mining bee in this country. Another one which is very specialist is a yellow loosestrife bee, and this only goes on yellow loosestrife, which it grows in marshy places. And again, if you want to see them in Devon, go to where the Topsham ferry goes across by the Exeter Canal, where the Topsham ferry goes across the river there, and find the yellow loosestrife there. Sort of early July into August time, end of June, that sort of time. If you go there, and you'll see the bee. It's an easy one. It's a small bee, but it's very easy to identify because it only goes on yellow loosestrife. So you look on there, and it's quite a small bee, but it collects enormous amounts of pollen and floral oils from the flowers for its nest. I've never seen its nest, but it nests in marshy ground and makes little waterproof nests underground. A few bees nest in snail shells, so these are snail shell nesting bees, which I mentioned one earlier. We have 3 species, and they find old snail shells, and then they will use these, clean them out, and use them to nest inside. So they're fabulous little creatures. They're most often found on chalk grassland and around the coast, places where there's sort of calcareous soils and there's lots of snails are good places. When we did the filming for Wild Isles, we went to Cerne Abbas Giant, which is a very good place for all of these bees, but particularly the broomstick bee. This is another one, the golden fringe mining bee, which tends to use bigger shells. And when she's finished her nest, she collects lots of leaf mastic and plugs it up with that. But the broomstick bee, it also seals its nest up with leaf mastic, but then it has a special trick of covering up with bits of grass. So it camouflages the nest with grass. And they're brilliant little bees to watch. So she's finished her nest, she turns the shell so the entrance is facing down. She sometimes digs it into the ground a bit, and then she collects hundreds of pieces of grass, and that's why she gets the name the broomstick bee, because you see this bee, looks like it's on a broomstick, flying along, these bits of grass flying through. And sometimes the grass is up to about 14 centimetres long, and so she works feverishly away, covering up her nest with these great big bits of grass. It's a highly entertaining little bee to watch. One you may see in your garden, which is a bit more unusual because the males of this bee are actually bigger than the females. Usually the males are smaller. And this is a wool carder bee, and it also has spikes on the end of its body there. So the male guards flowers, in the case of this bee, and he defends the flowers against any other bees apart from female wool carder bees. So, and he can actually maim them, which he had actually done to this bumblebee, you'll see in a minute. If they're too persistent, he can actually spike them. And this one, he'd actually bust the wing of the bumblebee, but a bumblebee kept crawling up the flower, and then he'd come up and chase it away. So a very aggressive bee, entertaining to watch if you've got a patch of woundwort, or in this case, Stachys lanata. It's a type of fur called lamb's ear, a furry type of woundwort. And if you grow this in a sunny spot in your garden, you've a very good chance of getting these bees coming in. Is that I don't think. Oh, and there's the female. So sorry, I'm not sure what's happening there. The female is called a wool carder bee because she's related to leafcutter bees, but instead of collecting leaves, she collects hairs from plants to make her little nests, like little woolly sleeping bags. And I said, if you grow lambs here, you may be lucky enough to see them actually collecting the wool. So they come in. This is one in our garden in June this year. She collects little balls of wool, and then she'll take them off, usually to a crevice somewhere. I've never found the nests in our garden. They go off somewhere and nest across the road somewhere. Never found them. But the writer Kate Bradbury, who lives in Brighton, one year she had them nesting in a bee hotel. So I did go around there and managed to see one coming in and building these fluffy sleeping bags for its babies. This is a leafcutter bee. So leafcutter bees do the same. They're similar, but they collect sections of leaf. So they use about 14 pieces of leaf to make each cell for their young. Sometimes they use petals. We had this one using rose petals in the garden, and she would collect these petals and form them all together into a little cell, then collect pollen, put that into the cell, and then lay an egg and then seal it up and make another one. And this is another species that came into our bee hotel, and this one, I could watch the behaviour of it over a few months, and actually built 28 completed cells in its lifetime. It's a huge number, amazing amount of activity for this little bee to do. And the reason she builds so many is because they have a cuckoo bee as well, and this is a sharp-tailed bee. This is a type of sharp-tailed bee, and these have sharp tails, and they spike open those leaf case nests of the leafcutter bee, and then they'll cut it open, then lay an egg inside, and then the larva of the sharp-tailed bee will destroy the larva of the leafcutter bee and eat all its food. So the leafcutter bee's got to stay one step ahead to keep all this going, really, and keep the populations up, and face off this sharp-tailed bee. You might get tiny bees in your bee hotel, so if you do have a bee hotel or you drill holes in logs and things, really make them between about 10 and about 2 millimeters, because there are some tiny little bees. This is a yellow-faced bee, and this one makes really small little cellophane cells and fills them with liquid nectar and pollen mix. So she doesn't collect the pollen on her body, she collects it in a sort of mouth and a gut, and then spits it out when she gets into the nest. And you've got these things around if you see this wasp, which is a very strange looking wasp with a very long tail. You see these flying around, and they have a very long ovipositor to lay eggs in the nest. This is a bee which I hadn't seen until this year, but it's maybe a bit commoner than we think in Devon. It seems to always be associated with thatched cottages. So I've found I know of 3 colonies now, and they're all sort of on the east side of Dartmoor, East Devon. This one's at Nadderwater, just outside Exeter, and the bees here are little scissor bees, which feed on they go on buttercups. They collect their pollen from buttercups. So quite a common plant, but they seem to really love to nest in thatch roofs, because all the colonies I've seen have always been in thatch roofs. So it's a potential another type of bee hotel to make is a thatch bee hotel. You might well attract, or if you've got a thatched house, or you may well have them in already, but a thatch bee hotel might work for these. They're sometimes called sleepy carpenter bees. They sleep in flowers. And they were quite common. There were hundreds nesting in that thatched cottage there. Now, as I said, some of the male bees are quite different looking to the females. This is one that occurs on the Mare in Exmouth, and this is called a pantaloon bee. And the males will, again, jump on the females, but any chance that the female, once she's mated, will kick him away with her big back legs. But this is an amusing thing I saw once when I was down there. There were some cinnabar moth caterpillars crossing the path, and the males are jumping on that. It looks vaguely, anything that looks vaguely like a female bee, they'll jump on. And this is the female pantaloon bee. She has these enormous back legs, and she will clear out her burrow that way and run back in. If you want to see those, they're on the very east end of the Mare at Exmouth, about sometime in July is the best time to see them, and they nest just at that spot there. Some flowers use bees, particularly male bees, to actually pollinate the flowers. So this is a bee orchid. I mean, in this country, they're self-pollinated bee orchids, but abroad, the bee orchids are pollinated by male longhorn bees. And the bee orchid actually looks like a female bee. And it's thought they might even produce a pheromone scent, which smells a bit like a bee as well. And it attracts the male into mate. In this case, the pollen has gone from the flower, but it would usually attach itself to his antennae. And this is some beetles which have had the same thing. So the pollen from the orchid is attached to the insects which visit the flowers, and then when they visit another flower, they pollinate that. So beetles are duped, but mainly male bees. Now these male bees don't have nests, so they're mining bees, but they'll roost during their short lives out on vegetation. So that's the pantaloon bee, and these are some little furrow bees in our garden in Buckfordsley. And this is a little sleepy, another sleepy bee. This is a shaggy bee, and this one sleeps in hawkbit flowers in the summer. Now the cuckoo bees, of course, don't have nests themselves. They raid other nests, so they have to sleep out in the open. And this is one which is the cuckoo bee of the tormental mining bee, another quite rare species, but is found around Dartmoor. And that's the female, that's the male. And they nest in little banks like this, little well-drained edges of paths and roads. This is at Holden Hill. And they roost sat up on a bit of grass stems. This is a little video of one roosting. Attach on themselves, and they somehow hold on with their jaws overnight. Have a bit of a clean. And then they'll just stay there. I suppose they're quite safe there in that position over the night. Now, oil beetles are another threat to the bees. So bees have got to be very busy to avoid all these parasites. So oil beetles will lay thousands of eggs. So each female can lay up to 40,000 eggs in the ground. These are violet oil beetles. And once the eggs hatch, they hatch into tiny little larvae called triungulin larvae. And these swarm up on flowers, and they attach themselves to any insects which go to the flower. And then you see some on the back of this bee here. So if the few that survive get onto certain female solitary bees and then get taken back to the nest. And then the larvae of the beetle feed on the pollen supply that the bees collected for her nest. And this is a bee which is flying at the moment. I've been watching these today. These are ivy bees. And if you look on ivy at this time of year, you're very likely to see these little stripy bees. They're related to a few other, they have a few other species in this family which are very similar. So there's a similar one which goes on heather, and another one which goes on sea aster. But the ones I've been watching today were at Branscombe Mouth, and they're swarming in the cliffs there at the moment. And you get thousands of males flying around, and they're intercepting the females. And as the females emerge, you get balls of males jumping onto a female, and they often roll down the cliff there, and eventually the mating pair will free themselves and fly off somewhere else to avoid all the other males. Now, the IVB was found new to science in about 1991, I think, early 90s. It first colonised the UK in 2001, and it's done very, very well, mainly because it's escaped its parasites. So there are things which go for it, but most of them, well, there's only 1 or 2 bees which have cottoned onto them now, but they've actually left their parasites on the other side of the channel, so they do very, very well. This is a little ecologist bee which does use this family of bees, and it has found ivy bees in other parts of the country and uses those as a host. But down here, these bees haven't found them yet. They're still using other species which fly earlier in the year. But they do have a parasitic oil beetle, which has a very interesting life cycle. This is a little orange oil beetle, and this lays eggs near the ivy bee colony. And these hatch into tiny little larvae, and it has a very interesting way of getting onto the female bee. So what happens, this is in Jersey a couple of weeks ago, we were on Jersey, and to see this, and all the ivy bee males are flying, and you found there's the oil beetle. It can fly. That was a female, it was full of eggs, and it couldn't really fly very well. And then here are the larvae, and they clump together, and it's thought that they look or smell a bit like a female bee, but they certainly attract the male ivy bees. They come in and have a look, and eventually one will come in and try and mate with that clump, and then all the triangulins will get onto his body, and then when he does actually mate with a female, they climb off, and then they end up in the nest of the female ivy bee. So a very clever little technique used by that, called Stenoria, the ivy bee oil beetle. Now, these are some, just showing you how important nest sites are for bees, because these are some ivy bees nest sites on Bovey Heath. And the nearest ivy to these nest sites is way over here and here, right here. So the nest site is on a warm, sandy slope, easy to burrow in. But they choose to nest here. These nest sites are very important for them because that's where their larvae are developing. That's where they need to warm up. They need a nice warm site where they can burrow. And so it can be a reasonable distance from the actual food supply which they're going after. This is another strange parasite called a stylops, and this is a really weird thing. It's not really known quite what sort of insect it is. It was thought maybe to be a beetle at one time. But that's the female, and she lives inside a bee's body. And then that's the male, which flies out. It's a strange looking creature. And he flies out and finds a parasitized female stylops. And then she lays eggs, which go onto flowers and then get picked up by other bees, and they're carried on that way. So there's a lot of things after bees. They have to be very industrious to survive. There's bee flies, which no doubt you're familiar with. They will, each one of these bee flies will lay hundreds of eggs, and the bee fly larva will crawl into a bee nest and then find a bee larva and eat it. Will suck all its insides out and then turn into one of these little bee flies. They look quite cute and furry, but they're quite nasty little things, really. And there's bee grabber flies as well, and these ones, they're funny looking flies with big googly eyes, and the female of this on the bottom has like a can opener tipped to her abdomen, and she'll fly around and grab hold of bumblebees, and then she she prizes open the segments of its abdomen and then lays an egg inside it, and then once the larva of this fly develops inside it, it actually brainwashes the bee into burying itself, so it will bury itself underground, so that this fly will be safe right over the winter. So quite gruesome things go on in the undergrowth. If you look on ivy this time of year, there's a lot of honeybees, and there's also mimics of honeybees. So this is a drone fly, which looks very much like a honeybee. So it gets protection from the fact that bees and wasps have stings, and there's a lot of creatures which look like bees and wasps. It's another kind of hoverfly which looks like a carder bee, which you can see on the Devil's Bit scabious, often around Dartmoor at this time of year. So that's it is a harmless hoverfly, but it looks very similar to a carder bee. And again, looking at habitats for bees. So this is at Spitchwick, which is a sandy area by the river there. Lots of people there, but they create a bit of erosion and bare ground, but it's a really, really good place for bees to nest because of that. There's lots of different species. A grey mining bee, it has a little oil beetle triangle in on there, and another one called a short fringe mining bee, a tawny mining bee, showing the quite distinct difference between the males and the females there, and a large gorse mining bee. So it's a really hot spot for bees at sites like this, where there's a really good nesting site, and there's plenty of foraging food around, but the bees can travel for a mile or so to find food if they need to. This is another one called a sandpit mining bee, and this one, as its name suggests, nest in the sandy areas by the river there, and they're amazing at finding their nests. They can somehow find them under the sand. They sort of fly around and then just dive down into the sand and find their nest underneath. And then they pop out again. So there's one that maybe you could attract actually by making sand pits. It tends to, on Dartmoor, it lives around the rivers. It also lives on sand dunes, so that's like Dawlish Warren. But it seems to be, I found them on tiny little bits of sand, so they do fly around and find these open bits of sand. It's quite a specialist thing. I mean, in our garden, I put quite a bit of sand down into the flower beds and attracted quite a few mining bees that way, which we didn't have before. Just by throwing sand on the soil during the winter and it washes down into the soil, it creates a nice habitat for the bees to burrow in. Also, just piles of sand somewhere, are good for bees. This is often on, where the council depots or on building sites where they've just left piles of sand around. Often there's lots of bees nesting in these sites. And this idea has been taken up. I've been persuading various people to make sand pits. They've done one at Sharpham House near Totnes, and this was out in Vienna. I was visiting my son in the spring, and they had a similar idea there as well for making little sand pits of open sand for, in this case, some small shaggy bees to nest in. And some of the habitats you may be able to create if you have land, or get created almost often by accident, are really good for bees to nest in. And this is at what was Riverford Farm Shop. When the car park was first built, they had this sort of dug out this bank, and it was quite a bit of bare ground to start with, and it was colonised by hundreds of yellow-legged mining bees for a few years. And you could go there and see hundreds of these things in the spring and summer. But since then, it's actually sort of grown over, and and the soil is actually a lot cooler once it has all the vegetation on. So it's not really warm enough for the bees now, and there's hardly any there now. So if you do create habitats like this, it's good to actually every now and again just sort of redo them, because they do like them at these sort of early stages. And looking at other habitats where bees will nest, this is a wall. An old stone wall. This is on Bodmin Moor. There's plenty of walls like this around Dartmoor, where you get this sort of silty soil in between the walls. And if it's south-facing, these can be really good places for bees to nest in. Again, they're quite small and unobtrusive, but they will find these and nest in them. And they're often, tiny little furrow bees or various sorts of mining bee which will go in there. And out on Dartmoor as well, there's a heather mining bee and other bees which use heather. So there's huge areas of foraging food, but to go and find them, you need to find these little bits of bare ground. So this is near Headland Warren, and there's a little patch by the road there, and if you go there, you'll find various little furrow bees and heather mining bees nesting there. Now, before we built all these structures, they would have naturally nested in places like this. So a tree plate and overturned tree provides a nice, soil base, and south-facing the better. That's the sort of place that bees would have naturally nested. So it's a really good nesting habitat for bees there. And some will use dead wood as well. So there's a fork-tailed flower bee, which we get in our garden. And we have some piles of logs. And I only just found it last year nesting in a log. This is the bee. It likes woundworts as well. And I found it nesting in a bit of wood, just out by the front of the house, in a very warm place. Because if you're putting up bee hotels and setting up habitats for them, really it's best to have them in the warmest place possible. If you have a south-facing wall, all the better. And various people have been working on this. Is someone I follow on Instagram who's been constructing a bee bank using all sorts of clay and sand and that sort of habitat. And I'm sure this will be successful in attracting a number of different bees to nest in. Now, as for plants, it's good to have a range of plants through the summer, through from early spring to autumn. So willow is a very important plant in the spring. For a lot of bees, a lot of the queen bumblebees which have overwintered will go on the willow. And then other common plants, hawthorns are really good for spring mining bees, blackthorn, dandelions, all these common plants, but when they're in abundance, they provide food for a lot of bees, and particularly if there are nesting sites nearby. So the closer there are banks and sandy banks and paths and tracks and things to the food supply, the more bees will nest there, because they don't have to travel so far and expend so much energy collecting the food. So these are some of the orange-tailed mining bees I showed you earlier, which really love dandelions. Other flowers which are really good are bird's foot trefoil, a very good plant for bees. This is down on the coast at Floral. That's attracting one of the little snail nesting bees, a golden fringed bee there. And clovers, again, really good. This is a Wilkes mining bee. Again, another quite common bee, absolutely loves clovers, and all sort of in that pea family, any plants like that. And again, another sort of typical bit of nesting habitat. This is on a China clay works in Bodmin, and some old spoil heaps. And these are vegetated over, but they have these banks and little edges where the bees can get in there and nest. And this is a good place to see this. It's a little tiny andrena, a small flecked mining bee it's called, and it flies in the summer. And in our garden we have a number of a range of plants from we have those lungworts which come out early in the spring, and then a range of flowers through the summer, and then through August into September we have a big patch of fleabane, and then at this time of year there's a Michaelmas daisy. So it's having that continual supply of food. The more there is over a longer period of the year, the more bees you will attract to your patch. As for the future, as I said, there are still new bees colonizing. And a few years ago, this bee, you may have seen these abroad. It's a violet carpenter bee. It's a huge, great thing, and it nests in bits of dead wood. And it is moving north, so it may well turn up and start breeding here more regularly. This was actually found nesting in Alphington in Exeter a few years ago. So there's a changing world, and there's a changing populations of bees out there, but it's a fascinating world to study. Once you get into it, it took me a while to actually find some of these elusive creatures, but they're well worth seeking out, and I hope you've seen, they're really fascinating behaviour. Okay, that's the end of the talk. So if you'd like any more information, have a look at my website, johnwalters.co.uk, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
John.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions? Any questions for John? Oh, okay. Try to pass the mic along.
How do you identify them? Because they're quite small and fast moving.
They are quite, I mean, it's a case of, I have got a collection of bees, so I did collect some specimens of bees to identify, because some of them you need to identify under the microscope, but a lot of them you can actually identify by going through those guides and the websites and things. A lot of the species are fairly easy once you put a bit of time into looking through. There's a number of species which are very easy to identify, things like the wool carder bee, the tawny mining bee, grey mining bee. So there's a range of species which are easy, and there's a bunch of species which are more specialist. But you can still learn to identify them to family without having to kill them and pin them and stick them under a microscope.
John, could you tell us what the difference between the new agri-environmental pollen and nectar mixes actually
supplied resources for, other than the generalists, are they pretty poor for the specialists that you've been talking about?
I don't know actually. I don't know what are in them.
Well, one of the worries is that they are just sort of providing food and resources for the generalists.
Yeah, I mean, may well be the thing. Yeah, it's some of these specialist bees are quite localised, as I've hinted there, and they need more sort of targeted planning. So there has been quite a bit of work on the large scabious mining bee, for instance, which Bug Life have been doing over the last few years by actually plug planting field scabious around the areas where the bee live, and that has worked. But more general sea mitches, now, as you say, yeah, they're good for the common generalist things, but some of these bees, as I said, are really quite specialist, and they do need a bit of extra sort of focused attention really to conserve them. A question here on it.
I was going to say, yeah, I don't know if you said it, the difference between a bee and a wasp.
Well, a bee is a kind of wasp, really. As I said, bees are vegan wasps. Think of that, furry vegan wasps. They've evolved from solitary wasps, but they are as...
The difference is one's a carnivore and one's not.
Yeah, really, yeah. There are a few wasps which feed on pollen, but most wasps are carnivorous, or omnivorous, really. But all bees feed on pollen and nectar.
Hi John, I'm
Hi.
Sigmund here. Thanks very much, that was great. My thought actually sort of follows on from Jerry's question actually. I was really struck by how many of your examples were in sort of human landscapes in some kind of ways, or either urban or associated with humans. I mean, I can see that a lot of that is bees like early successional habitats, but how many? But if you went to like an average field in mid-Devon, would you have 39 species like you have in your garden? And, how? No, I don't think so.
No, probably not.
Yeah, I'm interested to know, sort of,
Yeah. Oh, that's the beauty of having a garden which you can manage, because then you can grow. It's having the variety of different flowers, because these bees are adapted to use different flowers. So some like clovers and some like dandelions and whatever. So yeah, it is having that variety of flowers in a small area with suitable nesting sites. So gardens are really good places really for garden, because there's a variety of nesting sites, and people put out bee hotels as well, but there's also in houses and mortar and walls, and also there's a variety of flowers. As long as people don't use pesticides, it does provide a food for a lot of species of bee, and they will find them. So in our garden, a lot of those species are things which I've hardly ever seen in other places, but we grow a bit of ragwort each year, and then various mining bees which like ragwort turn up. I don't know where they come from sometimes, they just appear. And like the little one that goes on the campanulas, the bellflowers, that I didn't think it even occurred in Devon. Then a friend found it down the road, and so I planted some nettle leaf bellflower, and there it was in the garden. Yes.
The male honeybee, the drone, dies after it mates.
Yeah.
Queen. Do any of these bees die?
No, these aren't quite the same, but they don't live very long, the males. They generally, like I was watching the ivy bees today, the females will live for maybe a couple of months, the males live for a couple of weeks usually. They sort of have a frantic life of flying around trying to find the females and mating with them.
Does the normal wasp attack these as well?
A wasp, wasp would attack them, yeah. I mean, wasps will attack, I saw wasps hunting ivy bees today, so that, wasps will hunt for any other insects that they can find, and hornets as well, which are big wasps. They hunt for other wasps, and also bumblebees and honeybees. Had one hunting for honeybees in the garden the other day. Yes?
How close are you filming from? Thinking about that early photo you showed of the potter.
Okay, yeah, potter wasp, yeah, that was, yeah.
And it was obviously so tiny.
Yeah.
How close
Well, because those wasps, bees, there's a lot to cover, but bees are really good at navigating. They obviously have to move around the landscape, and the potter wasp female will build a pot out on the heather somewhere, and I run after it and find it building its pot. And but it has a map of the heath in its head, so I can get really close because I find the wasp building its pot, it flies off, and then I sit there and it comes back and it's like, what's happened here? Because I'm a different landmark. So I let it fly around for a minute or two, and then I sit back, and then it goes to its pot and carries on building. And while it's there, I just move my camera really close. And then when it leaves, it knew it had a problem navigating, so it remaps. And it remaps me as well. So I can have my camera right next to it by the end, and it's not worried at all. So that's how I do that in that species. But that's one that you can do that with. So.
Thank you, and I take my hats off to John, because actually he'll sit there for days and days to find the wasp. Okay. Okay, and one more. Okay.
I've got, I think, a common carder wasp, bee wasp.
Yeah.
Sort of bee nest in my garden.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if will they come back to the same place?
No, they won't. That's why those mites that I showed you on the bumblebee go on the young queens, because they may well, another queen next year might well choose a similar spot, but they won't reuse a nest as such. Is it in like a tussock of grass or?
No, it's just on the ground. It's like sticks and leaves.
Oh right, yeah,
and
yeah.
moss on the top.
Yeah. They sometimes go down.
Watch them sort of carding the moss.
Oh, brilliant, yeah. Oh, they're great things to watch, yeah, because bees, bumblebees will nest in a variety of places, and those ones, I've found them in grass tussocks or under, as you say, sometimes in sort of piles of sticks and compost heaps, that sort of place.
Does it seem to be underground?
No, they're not underground. They're always on the surface of the.
So they won't live through the winter then?
No, what happens is because they go quite late, so there'll be still workers there at the moment. They'll produce new queens and males, and then all the workers will die, and then the males mate with the queens, and then only the queens will overwinter, and they'll appear next spring.
John, I have a question
Yes.
about leaving edges on when you're cutting for meadows.
Right.
For the benefits of not just bees but other insects. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when you're cutting, actually leaving some of the vegetation. Yeah, it's good to have if you've got a meadow or grassland of any size really, it's good to not cut all of it in any one season. Always leave some patches, and if you've got carder bees, which are often nest in these tussocky bits of grass, you might well see those, and you might think, well, I'm not going to cut that bit this year. But always leave some areas uncut, because it's not good for just bees, but things like meadow brown butterfly caterpillars are around all through the winter, so they need somewhere to hide away. And lots of other insects as well, which live in the meadows, will be there somewhere in the winter. And so having some edges which are uncut, and you can change these around in different years, so different areas are uncut, but leave some bits uncut, and that would certainly benefit the insects in the meadow.